Welcome to my video lecture series in web development using Vue.js. This is Professor Janice Raymond Tan from the College of Computing and Engineering. For this video lecture, we will cover the topics about form input bindings. Throughout this video, we will discuss basic usage, text binding, multi-line text binding, checkbox, radio, select binding, value bindings, and modifiers. Basic usage. Often in front of the web development, we need to get and save the value from users' inputs, process, change and display the result in the form of HTML elements. Two-way binding is the method to be used in order to achieve this kind of scenario. You can use the vmodel directive to create a two-way bindings on form input, text area, and select elements. It automatically picks the correct way to update the element based on the input type. Although a bit magical, vmodel is essentially syntax sugar for updating data on user input events, plus special care for some edge cases. Vmodel directive will ignore the initial value, checked or selected attributes found on any form elements. It always treats the view instance data as the source of truth. You should declare the initial value on the JavaScript side inside the data option of your component. vmodel internally uses different properties and emits different events for different input elements. Text and text area elements use value property and input event. Checkboxes and radio buttons use check property and change event. Select fields use value as a prop and change as an event. Text. We can perform two-way binding for text. In the given example, message is a data model property defined in the Vue instance, which is initialized to an empty string. The idea of two-way binding here, every time the user types any content inside the text, it is simultaneously displayed in the p tag because of interpolation, the mustache binding, thus changing the value of the text also changes the value being displayed and therefore performing two-way binding in text. Multi-line text. We can perform two-way binding for multi-line text. In the given example, message is a data model property defined in the Vue instance which is initialized to an empty string. The idea of two-way binding here, every time the user types any content inside the text area, it is simultaneously displayed in the p tag because of interpolation, applying a simple style. Thus, changing the value of the text also changes the value being displayed and therefore performing two-way binding in a multi-line text. Checkbox. We can perform two-way binding for checkbox. In the given example, isCheck is a data model property defined in the Vue instance which is initialized to a boolean value false. The idea of two-way binding here, every time the user checks and unchecks the checkbox, it will simultaneously update and display the value of its check property in the label tag, thus performing two-way binding in a checkbox. We can also apply two-way binding in multiple checkboxes by defining check names as the data model property defined in the Vue instance which is initialized as an empty array. This one. The idea of two-way binding here, every time the user checks and unchecks a specific checkbox, the value assigned to that checkbox will be added automatically in the check names array since we set each checkbox with vmodel containing the check names array. That is why in the sample output, Jack and John were displayed as the values of check names array since they are both checked or selected. Radio. We can also apply two-way binding in multiple radio buttons. In the given example, picked is a data model property in Vue instance which is initialized as an empty string. The idea of two-way binding here, every time the user checks and selects a specific radio button, the value assigned to that radio button will be saved automatically in the pick data model property since we set each checkbox with vModel containing the picked data model property. That is why in the sample output, 2 is displayed using the span interpolation here, since the radio button with the value 2 is selected. Select. We can dynamically render options with V4. In the given example, selected is a data model property in view instance, which is initialized as an empty string that will hold the value depending on the selected option. And the options data model property is defined as an array of objects having text and value. This one. The idea is to render the V4 using V4 the contents of the options and bind each value and text in each option that will be rendered. Additionally, selected data model property will contain the value of the option that is currently selected. That is why in the given sample output, B is displayed using the span interpolation since the option with the text 2 is selected. So selecting 2 in the option will return B since the value of the object in the options array is B if the user selects 2 as defined in the option.text for every option element. Value bindings. For radio, checkbox and select options, the vModel binding values are usually static strings or booleans for checkboxes. But sometimes we may want to bind the value to a dynamic property on the view instance. We can use vbind to achieve that. In addition, using vbind allows us to bind the input value to non-string values. In the given example, we are able to define toggle as a data model property. Every time the user clicks on the checkbox, it calls for the showToggleValue method, which is defined in the methods property of the view instance. It returns the corresponding value, either null as a starting value, yes, and no. The true value and false value attributes don't affect the input's value attribute because browsers don't include unchecked boxes in form submissions. To guarantee that one of the two values is submitted in a form, example is yes or no, use radio inputs instead. Modifiers. By default, vModel syncs the input with the data after each input event. So you can add the lazy modifier to instead sync after change events. So what happens before if we will type example in a given text field, every time we type a certain content, it will directly or it will be synced automatically. That's why every time you type an entry inside your field, it will be displayed right away on your web browser. So we can avoid doing that by using modifiers. In our example here, we use the lazy modifier. In the given example, applying the lazy modifier will allow us to control the default behavior of the input every time it reads an input event. Instead of showing the character being typed in the span tag every input event, we are able to display the content of the message data model property only if the user hits the enter key. So that is the way for us to capture or to trigger the displaying of values when the user hits the enter key. So by using the lazy modifier. Number modifier. If you want user input to be automatically typecast as a number, you can add the number modifier to your vModel managed inputs. This is often useful because even with type number, the value of HTML input elements always returns a string. If the value cannot be parsed with parse float, then the original value is returned. In the given example, applying the number modifier will allow us to convert the number input from the user into a number without the need of applying parsefloat JavaScript method. Notice that age is defined as string with an empty string as a default value, but we are able to compute in the console window the sum of the number entered and 5 Remember that without parsing, JavaScript will just concatenate the value of age to 5. And that is the default behavior of JavaScript. But applying the number modifier solves the problem of conversion. If you want white space from the user input to be trimmed automatically, you can add the trim modifier to your vModel manage inputs. In the given example, applying the trim modifier will automatically trim the extra spaces from the user input, just like as shown in the given screenshot. Now in summary, we could say that you can use the vModel directive to create two-way data bindings on form input, text area, and select elements. Interpolation and text areas will not work, that is why we need to use vModel directive instead. Dynamic options of a selected element can be rendered with v4. For radio, checkbox, and select options, the vModel binding values are usually static strings or booleans for checkboxes. Lazy, number, and trim are some modifiers we can use in an input element. For this lesson's activity, create a simple web application using Vue.js that will allow a user to input the details in a form to be displayed in a table format upon clicking the Save button using form input bindings with the following details to be entered. Post the link of your working code in the Week 6 channel of our MS Teams using your account created in the following link. That's it for now. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoyed this video. For inquiries, feel free to post your questions in our group chat. In our next video, we will discuss all about class and style bindings. Don't forget to visit the link in the references section for more information about this lesson. See you in the next video.